There's a room in North Wales where time stopped in 1995, not because someone wanted it to, but because no one had the courage to remember what happened there. Inside that room, 24 human beings had their brains deliberately damaged with surgical instruments. One never woke up. The others, they walked out as someone, something else. Their families didn't recognize them. They didn't recognize themselves. And here's what keeps me awake at night. Those 24 people weren't the exception. They were the rule. What I'm about to tell you isn't just about Denbigh Asylum. It's about what we're capable of when we convince ourselves we're helping. It's about the places that remember suffering long after we try to forget. And it's about asking yourself a question you probably don't want to answer. If someone decided you were broken, how far would they go to fix you? Before we walk through those doors together, I need you to understand something. This channel exists because there are stories the world wants to bury. Stories about real places where real people suffered in ways that don't fit comfortably into history books. If you're here, it's because you're not afraid to look at the uncomfortable truth. So here's what I'm asking. Subscribe to this channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because every subscription tells YouTube that these stories matter. That we're not going to let places like Denbigh Asylum fade into convenient obscurity. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear deserves to be remembered, and I promise you by the end of this video, you'll understand why forgetting is not an option. Picture this: October 1848. In the rolling hills of Denbigh, North Wales, a structure rises from the earth like a Gothic cathedral to human suffering. 20 acres of donated land, £27,500, 200 beds. Architect Thomas Fulljames designed it in the Victorian style. All imposing towers and dark stone, built to last centuries. But here's what the architects didn't plan for. This building would eventually house 1,500 human souls in a space meant for 200. They didn't plan for the screams that would soak into those stone walls. They didn't plan for the fact that opening the doors would be easier than closing them, and that closing them would be easier than remembering what happened inside. The North Wales Hospital, originally called the North Wales County's Lunatic Asylum, was born from good intentions. A group of wealthy landowners, clergy and businessmen met at Denbigh General Infirmary in October 1842 with a noble purpose: to create proper care for the mentally ill of North Wales. Before this, if your mind betrayed you, your options were grim. Your family might lock you in a room. You might be sent to an English asylum where you couldn't speak your own language, or you'd end up in a workhouse, that Victorian dumping ground for anyone society didn't know what to do with. The committee raised money through public subscriptions. Even Queen Victoria and Prince Albert donated £50 each. It seemed like progress. It seemed like compassion. It seemed like civilization taking care of its most vulnerable. But good intentions are just the first stone in the road to hell, and Denbigh Asylum would prove that the distance between healing and horror is shorter than anyone wants to admit. The building itself was a masterpiece of intimidation. Jacobean architecture mixed with Victorian sensibility, designed not just to house patients, but to announce to the world that madness had been contained. The main building formed a U-shape, with wings extending like arms ready to embrace or restrain depending on your perspective. There was a chapel for salvation, a morgue for those beyond it, a brewery, a bakery, Turkish baths. It was a self-contained world, a kingdom unto itself where the rules of the outside ceased to apply. In 1853, they replaced candlelight with gas lamps. By 1897, they added a laundry house, boiler room, engine room, and an isolation hospital. Each expansion was an admission. We need more room for the broken people. Each new wing was a confession. We don't know how to fix them, but we know how to store them. Can you feel it? That architectural weight. Imagine standing in front of that building in 1848, knowing you're about to walk through those doors, and they might never open for you again. Imagine being a family member, convincing yourself that this Gothic monstrosity is hope. Imagine being staff, showing up for your first day of work, and realizing that those corridors stretch farther than your compassion ever could. The building was designed to separate men's wards from women's wards, the violent from the docile, the curable from the incurable, the living from the dying. But here's what no architectural plan could show. How do you separate the person from their suffering when the suffering becomes all they are? Would you walk through those doors, knowing what we know now, knowing that good intentions built this place, and good intentions filled it beyond capacity, and good intentions would eventually wire electrodes to people's skulls and drive ice picks through their eye sockets? Would you trust that the people in white coats knew better than you about your own mind? Let's talk about what it meant to be insane in Victorian Wales. The Lunacy Act of 1890 made it shockingly easy to lock someone away. It took only 2 doctors' signatures. 2, not a trial, not a lengthy evaluation. Just 2 men agreeing that you didn't fit. And the reasons? They read like a catalogue of human experience. Depression, infidelity, addiction, epilepsy, postnatal complications, menopause. Women who were disappointed in love. Men who drank too much. Wives that inconvenient husbands wanted gone. Eccentric relatives standing between families and inheritances. The asylum became a solution for social problems dressed up as medical ones. You weren't difficult or heartbroken or overwhelmed. You were mad, and madness had a cure. Or so they told themselves. The records are there. 30,000 patient files spanning from 1848 to 1995. They're stored in Denbighshire archives now, some of the most comprehensive asylum records in the entire country. Each file tells a story. Margaret Jones from Denbigh, admitted for the 3rd time in 1890, sympathized with Florence Maybrick, a woman sentenced to death for allegedly poisoning her abusive husband. Margaret claimed that, but for her, Mrs. Maybrick would have hanged. Think about that. A woman locked in an asylum, finding kinship with another woman facing the gallows. What does that tell you about who ended up in these places? Ellen Owen from Holyhead. Her hospital notes state plainly that her mind became deranged due to her intemperate husband's ill treatment. She didn't go mad. She was driven there. And the asylum became her refuge and her prison in equal measure. John Jones, admitted for the 5th time in 1890, was literally called a lunatic. His father attributed his first attack to the full moon. Working as a labourer in South Wales when he became unwell again, his father, Richard, had to travel south to bring him home. The case notes say John was content to be back at Denbigh, greeting former acquaintances and expressing a great desire to stay here to assist with the harvesting. Read that again, he wanted to stay. The asylum had become his home because the world outside had no place for him. His condition varied wildly, sometimes low, sometimes excited, and he remained in the hospital for more than 10 years. When he was finally discharged in 1902, it wasn't because he was cured. He was listed as relieved and sent to the workhouse. From one institution to another, from one kind of forgetting to another. But John Jones had it better than some. Let me tell you about Richard Jones, 18 years old, from Blaenau Festiniog, admitted in 1902 with a diagnosis of moral insanity. Think about that term. Moral insanity, not a broken mind, but a broken morality. The doctor described him as a most intelligent youth, except that his appreciation of right and wrong is deficient. Richard settled into the hospital routine, worked daily, promised to turn over a new leaf. Within weeks, attendants found him trying to hang himself by his scarf from the top of his bedstead. When asked why, he said it was fear of being sent home that prompted the attempt. He would rather die than leave. What does it say about the world outside those walls when death inside seems preferable? Richard stayed for 8 years. 8 years of his youth spent in an asylum because someone decided his moral compass was broken. The overcrowding was relentless. By 1878, Dr. Williams, the medical superintendent, was dealing with regular criticism from the commissioners in lunacy about cramped conditions and staff shortages. Beds were pushed into any available space, sometimes so close together that patients had to get in and out at the foot of the bed. Imagine that. Imagine trying to sleep surrounded by the sounds of other people's nightmares. Imagine being so close to strangers that you can hear them breathe, hear them cry, hear them lose what's left of their minds. Dr. Williams predicted in his annual report that the hospital might become a receptacle for the care and custody of the incurable, rather than a place where patients could be cured and returned home. He was right. Even after extensions were completed in 1881, accommodation remained insufficient. The asylum wasn't a hospital anymore. It was a warehouse, a storage facility for people who society had decided were beyond repair. Close your eyes for a moment. Smell the disinfectant that never quite covers the stench of too many bodies in too little space. Hear the echo of footsteps on stone floors, the rattle of keys on heavy iron rings, the low murmur of voices that have forgotten how to speak to anyone who might listen. Feel the cold that seeps from the walls no matter the season, the kind of cold that settles in your bones and makes you wonder if you'll ever be warm again. This was daily life in Denbigh Asylum. This was normal. This was care. Now we come to the part that keeps me awake. The treatments. Before I continue, I need to warn you. What follows includes descriptions of invasive medical procedures that some may find disturbing. These are historical facts, documented and verified, but they're not easy to hear. If you need to step away, I understand. But if you can stay, please do. Because this is where good intentions curdle into something monstrous. This is where the desire to heal transforms into the willingness to harm. Let me be clear. The people administering these treatments believed they were helping. That's what makes this so terrifying. They weren't monsters. They were professionals, following the accepted medical practices of their time, which means you and I, placed in their position, might have done the same things. We like to think we wouldn't. But history suggests otherwise. It started mild. Turkish baths for depression, steam and heat to sweat out the melancholy, hard labor in the fields and kitchens, the Victorian belief that idle hands were the devil's workshop. So keep them busy and maybe sanity would follow. These treatments were almost quaint in their naivety, but they didn't work. And when treatments don't work, desperate people try desperate measures. For patients deemed hysterical, they administered mercury, highly toxic, but it shut people down, made them docile. A chemical restraint dressed up as medicine. Antimony, now used in fire retardants, was given to keep patients feeling sick so they'd be less prone to violence. Read that again. They deliberately made people ill to make them easier to manage. That's not healing, that's control. Then came the convulsive therapies. In the 1930s, a Hungarian physician named Ladislaus von Meduna noticed that epileptic patients with schizophrenia experienced remission of symptoms after seizures. His logic was simple and horrifying. If seizures help, let's cause seizures. First came insulin shock therapy in the early 1930s. They'd inject patients with massive doses of insulin, deliberately inducing hypoglycemic comas. The patient would convulse, sometimes violently. Sometimes they'd wake up, sometimes they wouldn't. The theory was that the shock would reset the brain, like turning a malfunctioning computer off and on again. Except the computer is a human consciousness, and nobody really knows what happens when you force it to shut down. Insulin shock was replaced by metrazole, a convulsant drug that was easier to administer but equally brutal. Imagine being told you need treatment. They strap you down. They inject you with a substance that feels like fire in your veins. Your body begins to seize. Your muscles contract so violently that bones break. Your teeth shatter against each other. You might bite through your own tongue. And through it all, you're conscious, at least at first, aware that this is being done to you on purpose, that someone believes this is making you better. In 1941, Denbigh Asylum began using electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. The Italians had pioneered it in 1938, and it spread through institutions worldwide like wildfire because it was faster, cleaner, more controllable than drugs. They'd attach electrodes to your temples, put a rubber gag in your mouth so you wouldn't bite through your tongue, and flip a switch. Electricity coursed through your brain. Your body convulsed with such force that limbs dislocated, spines fractured, teeth broke. The immediate aftermath was often stupor, confusion, and profound memory loss. Patients would wake up not knowing where they were, who they were, what year it was. Some of those memories never came back. But even electroshock wasn't the worst. The worst was the lobotomy. Between 1942 and 1944, 24 patients at Denbigh Asylum underwent prefrontal lobotomies. Let me describe what that means. The surgeon would drill holes in your skull or, in the later transorbital method, force a surgical instrument that looked like an ice pick through the back of your eye socket, piercing the thin bone that separates your eyes from your frontal lobes. Then they'd wiggle it around, severing the neural connections between your prefrontal cortex and the rest of your brain. The prefrontal cortex is what makes you you. It's where personality lives, where decision-making happens, where your sense of self resides, and they were cutting it apart, on purpose. One of those 24 patients died on the table. The others survived, but what survived wasn't quite the person who went under the knife. British psychiatrist Maurice Partridge, who studied 300 lobotomy patients, described the results honestly. The treatment achieved its effects by reducing the complexity of psychic life. That's a clinical way of saying they made people simpler, less complicated, less human. Spontaneity disappeared. Self-awareness faded. Emotional depth flattened into a kind of pleasant blankness. Some patients became childlike. Some became apathetic, unable to care about anything. Some lost the ability to control basic functions. All of them lost something essential, something that can't be measured or quantified, but that we recognize as the spark that makes a person themselves. And here's the truly haunting part. This was considered a success because the patients were calmer, easier to manage, less troublesome. They'd solved the problem of mental illness by erasing the person experiencing it. Think about being a family member. Your daughter, your son, your spouse goes into that hospital with depression or anxiety, or what we'd now call PTSD. They come out, but they're not them anymore. They don't laugh at the old jokes. They don't get angry or sad or frustrated. They just exist in a kind of perpetual fog. And the doctors tell you this is better, this is healing. Would you believe them? Or would you grieve for the person you lost while they're still standing right in front of you? Here's what I want you to consider. These treatments continued into the 1960s and 70s, not the 1860s, the 1960s. While the Beatles were recording albums, while humanity was preparing to walk on the moon, people at Denbigh Asylum were having their brains deliberately damaged because doctors thought it would help. How did we convince ourselves this was acceptable? How did entire institutions, medical boards, families, governments, look at lobotomy and say, yes, this is the answer? And here's the really uncomfortable question. What are we doing right now, in our time, that future generations will look back on with the same horror? The air shifts as you walk deeper into the asylum's history. There's a heaviness here, a thickness that settles on your chest. The smell changes too, less disinfectant now, more decay, more earth. You can almost taste the moisture in the air, feel the weight of all those years pressing down. Take a breath. We're about to enter the part of this story that deals with endings, with the patients who never left. By the 1960s, something began to shift. Minister of Health Enoch Powell pushed for what they called care in the community, the idea that people with mental illness should be treated in their communities, not locked away in massive Victorian fortresses. It was a noble concept. It was also catastrophically underfunded and poorly implemented. But for Denbigh Asylum, it meant the beginning of the end. In 1987, they drew up a 10-year plan for closure. Sections began shutting down in 1991. The main hospital closed its doors for the last time in 1995, after 147 years of operation, thousands upon thousands of patients, generations of suffering, and then silence. But what happened in those years between closure and now? The building sat empty, slowly decaying. In 2003, a company called Acebench Investments bought it for £310,000. Then it was transferred to an offshore company registered in the British Virgin Islands, then to another entity. The ownership became deliberately murky, impossible to trace. And through all these transfers, the decay accelerated. Vandals smashed windows. Looters stripped everything of value. Then came the fires. A major blaze in November 2008. Two more in 2017, another in April 2018. Each fire damaged the structure so badly that entire sections had to be demolished, deemed beyond repair. The building that had contained so much human suffering was now being systematically destroyed, collapsing under the weight of its own dark history. But here's where the story gets even darker. You know about the patients who left, either cured or transferred or released into a world that had no infrastructure to support them. But what about the patients who never left? What about the ones who died within those walls? Many patients who died at Denbigh were never claimed by their families. They were buried in communal areas at Denbigh Cemetery, without individual headstones to mark their graves, no names carved in stone, no flowers left by loved ones. Just unmarked earth covering bodies that were once people with hopes and fears and dreams. Families who might have tried to find them after death discovered no individual records, no way to locate where their loved one rested, as if they'd never existed at all. Think about that. Imagine dying far from home, your mind fractured by illness or treatment or both, and being buried in an unmarked communal grave. No funeral attended by people who loved you. No marker with your name and dates that prove you lived. Just a plot of ground that looks like every other plot of ground, slowly being forgotten. How many people rest there? Based on the hospital's population and mortality rates over nearly 150 years, we're talking about hundreds of souls, maybe more, all resting in graves that no one tends, that no one visits, that barely anyone even knows exist. And the morgue, it was small, far too small for the scale of this place, for the number of people who passed through over a century and a half. The records are incomplete. There are gaps, silences, names that appear once in the files and never again, lives that started in those pages and ended without notation. The Denbigh archives hold 30,000 patient files, annual reports, committee minutes, financial records. But even with all that documentation, people slipped through the cracks. Some simply disappeared from the records, their passing noted only by an empty bed that was immediately filled by someone else. Picture standing in that cemetery today. The grass has grown tall. The few stones that exist for other burials, not the asylum patients, are weathered and illegible. You're surrounded by the dead, but you can't see them, can't identify them, can't acknowledge their individual humanity. Just a general sense that beneath your feet lie dozens, hundreds of forgotten people, and in the distance, you can see the ruined hospital building, its windows empty as eye sockets, its doors hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The wind moves through broken corridors and carries sounds that might be branches scraping against stone or might be something else entirely. This is what forgetting looks like. This is what happens when we decide some lives don't matter enough to remember. After the hospital closed in 1995, something interesting happened in the abandonment. The asylum became mythologized. Stories of hauntings spread through the local community and beyond. Ghost hunters arrived with cameras and recording equipment. Urban explorers climbed through cut-wire fencing to walk the halls and photograph the decay. Teenagers dared each other to spend nights there. And everyone who entered reported the same things, an overwhelming sense of presence, the feeling that they weren't alone. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether ghosts are real. That's not the point. The point is that something about Denbigh Asylum makes people feel watched, makes them feel that the building remembers. And there are specific stories that have emerged, consistent accounts that multiple visitors have reported over the years. There's the Grey Lady, seen standing in the broken windows of the upper floors watching. Witnesses describe a figure in old-fashioned dress, there one moment and gone the next. Then there are the whispers in Welsh, the old language of the patients, heard echoing through empty corridors when no one else is present, and perhaps most disturbing, the sound of footsteps that match your own pace exactly, following just behind you, stopping when you stop, walking when you walk. Urban explorer and photographer Matthew Grokut spent time documenting the ruins. He said, "It was by far the creepiest place I have ever been into. There were so many strange noises emanating from the buildings that I really didn't want to wander too far from my companion." But some of the most compelling accounts come from former staff members. Peter Glenn, who worked as a nurse at the hospital, told a story that still circulates. He described arriving for a night shift and hearing a storage cabinet in the staff room banging repeatedly, the doors swinging open and shut with force. When he investigated, the cabinet was empty and there was no draft, no logical explanation for the movement. He also recalled seeing a patient standing on the veranda one evening, clear as day, recognizable. The problem? That patient had died 2 days earlier. These aren't stories told for entertainment. These are accounts from people who worked there, who knew the building intimately, who had no reason to fabricate. Maybe it's just the power of suggestion. Maybe abandoned hospitals trigger something primal in us, some evolutionary warning system that tells us places of suffering should be avoided. Or maybe, and stay with me here, maybe places can remember. Maybe trauma soaks into walls the way water soaks into wood. Maybe the accumulated anguish of 1,500 souls living in conditions we'd now consider torture leaves an imprint that doesn't fade just because the building empties. There's a concept in psychology called place memory, the idea that locations can hold emotional residue from traumatic events. People report feeling overwhelming sadness in concentration camps, even if they know nothing of the history. They feel rage in former prisons. They feel despair in asylums. Science hasn't fully explained this phenomenon. Whatever the mechanism, Denbigh Asylum is saturated with it. Walk those halls and you're walking through layers of accumulated human misery. Every room held someone who was terrified or confused or in pain. Every bed was someone's entire world. Every locked door was someone's reminder that they'd lost their freedom. Multiply that by hundreds of patients and nearly 150 years, and you get something that transcends ordinary decay. You get a building that feels alive with the echoes of the dead. Would you spend a night there, alone, knowing what you know now about who suffered within those walls and how they suffered and how many never left? Could you walk past the room where lobotomies were performed and not imagine the patients strapped down and terrified, about to lose themselves forever? Could you stand in the morgue and not think about all the bodies that passed through, all the lives that ended without anyone to mourn them? I couldn't, and I think that's the appropriate response. Some places should unsettle us. Some places should resist our attempts to sanitize or romanticize them. Denbigh Asylum is one of those places. Let me tell you what really frightens me about Denbigh Asylum. It's not the ghosts or the grey lady or the footsteps following you through empty halls. It's not the lobotomies or the electroshock or the unmarked graves, as horrific as all of that is. What frightens me is how ordinary it all was. The doctors who performed lobotomies went home to families. They had dinner, read bedtime stories to their children, slept peacefully. The nurses who administered electroshock therapy weren't cackling villains. They were working-class people trying to earn a living, following orders, doing what they were trained to do. The families who committed inconvenient relatives weren't monsters. They were exhausted caregivers, people at the end of their rope, convinced by authority figures that institutionalization was the best option. Everyone involved was just human, making human decisions based on human limitations within human systems that were fundamentally broken. And that's the truly existential horror here, because it means none of us are exempt. None of us can comfortably distance ourselves from what happened at Denbigh and say, well, I would never. Would you, really? If you lived in 1942 and a respected doctor told you that a lobotomy could cure your child's depression, would you refuse? If you were a nurse in 1950 and refusing to administer electroshock meant losing your job and condemning your own family to poverty, would you walk away? If you were overwhelmed caring for a parent with dementia and a physician assured you the asylum was the compassionate choice, would you resist? I'd like to think I would. You'd probably like to think you would, but statistics suggest otherwise. Most people, when placed in systems that normalize cruelty, participate in that cruelty, not because they're evil, but because humans are social creatures who defer to authority and conform to institutional norms even when those norms are monstrous. This is the lesson Denbigh Asylum teaches us if we're brave enough to hear it. The distance between civilization and barbarity is much shorter than we want to believe. We built this magnificent Gothic structure with the best intentions. We staffed it with trained professionals. We funded it with public money and royal donations. We created policies and oversight committees and annual reports. We did everything right, according to the standards of the time, and still it became a place of systematic human destruction. Still, people were warehoused and experimented on and erased from memory. Still, the vulnerable were made more vulnerable, the suffering were made to suffer more, and the forgotten were forgotten so thoroughly that we don't even know all their names. If that could happen then, with all those good intentions and professional standards and institutional safeguards, what makes us think it couldn't happen now? Look around. Look at our institutions. Our prisons, where mentally ill people are incarcerated because we closed the asylums, but never built adequate community mental health infrastructure. Our immigration detention centers, where children are separated from parents and held in conditions that traumatize them permanently. Our nursing homes, where the elderly are often neglected or abused because we're understaffed and underfunded, and we've decided that end-of-life care isn't worth investing in. Our psychiatric hospitals, where restraints and isolation are still used, where medication is still sometimes administered against will, where the power dynamic between doctor and patient remains fundamentally unchanged from Victorian times. Are these institutions perfect analogues to Denbigh Asylum? No. Are they better in many ways? Absolutely. But they're still systems where vulnerable people are contained and controlled, where suffering occurs behind closed doors, where it's easier to forget than to fix, and future generations will look back at us with the same mixture of horror and disbelief that we now direct at Denbigh. Here's the existential question that keeps me up at night. Are we the heroes of this story, or are we the villains? Are we the enlightened moderns who look back with appropriate horror at Victorian barbarism, or are we the complacent participants in systems of suffering that we've simply learned to justify better? I think the answer is both. We're capable of recognizing past atrocities while simultaneously perpetuating present ones. We're capable of genuine compassion and systematic cruelty. We're capable of building beautiful Gothic hospitals with the sincere intention to heal and then filling them with screams. That's not a comforting truth, but it's a necessary one, because the alternative, believing that we're fundamentally different from the people who ran Denbigh Asylum, that we're morally superior, that we would never, that alternative is dangerous. It's the same hubris that allowed good people to think lobotomies were healing. So let me ask you directly, what are you participating in right now that future generations will condemn? What systems are you part of, through your taxes, your votes, your silence, that cause suffering you're choosing not to see? What vulnerable populations are we warehousing, medicating into compliance, erasing from public consciousness? I don't ask this to make you feel guilty. Guilt is useless if it doesn't lead to action. I ask because Denbigh Asylum isn't just history. It's a warning. It's a mirror held up to human nature, showing us what we're capable of when we prioritize order over compassion, efficiency over humanity, institutional convenience over individual dignity. And the reflection is ugly, but looking away doesn't make it less true. Let me bring this back to the individual, because statistics numb us. 1,500 patients is a number too large to comprehend emotionally. But Margaret Jones was real. Ellen Owen was real. John Jones, who wanted to stay to help with the harvest, was real. Richard Jones, who tried to hang himself rather than leave, was real. Those 24 lobotomy patients were real. The one who died on the table had a name, a family, a life before the ice pick pierced their skull. And we don't know most of their names. That's what haunts me most. Not that they suffered, though that's horrific enough, but that they suffered in anonymity. That their pain was so systematic, so routine, so institutional, that they became case numbers rather than people. Patient 4194. Subject for lobotomy procedure. Body processed through the small morgue. No names, no stories, no acknowledgement of the unique, irreplaceable human being whose consciousness was extinguished or altered or traumatized beyond repair. I want to honor them now, not with names I don't have, but with acknowledgement of what they endured. To the woman admitted because her husband beat her and the doctors decided she was the problem. I see you. You weren't mad. You were trapped. To the man who was called a lunatic because the moon affected him, who found more kindness in the asylum than in his own home. I see you. You deserved better than either option. To the 18-year-old diagnosed with moral insanity, who understood that death was preferable to returning to a world that had no place for someone like him. I see you. Your pain was valid. Your fear was rational. To the 24 souls who went under the knife believing they would be healed and emerged as strangers to themselves, I see you. What was done to you was not healing. It was harm, dressed in medical language. And to the one who never woke up, whose name we don't know, whose grave in that communal plot bears no marker, I see you. Your life mattered. Your death mattered. The fact that the world forgot you doesn't mean you weren't worth remembering. This is why we tell these stories. Not to wallow in darkness or exploit suffering for entertainment, but to bear witness. To say, these people existed. These things happened. This is what we're capable of. And we have a choice about whether we learn from it or repeat it. Every abandoned asylum is a monument to human fallibility. Every unmarked grave is a reminder that society's most vulnerable can be erased with shocking ease. Every archived case file is a small act of resistance against forgetting. The bureaucrats who created those files, the archivists who preserved them, the researchers who study them, they're all participating in the essential human task of remembering, of refusing to let suffering be for nothing by at least bearing witness to it. That doesn't undo the harm, it doesn't heal the trauma, but it breaks the cycle of forgetting that allows harm to recur. Imagine one last walk through Denbigh Asylum before the apartments go up. It's twilight. The Gothic towers cast long shadows across the overgrown grounds. You push through a doorway, the hinges scream in protest, or maybe that's just the wind. Inside, the air is thick with dust and decay and something else, something you can't quite name. Your footsteps echo on cracked tiles. Water drips somewhere in the darkness. The walls are covered in peeling paint and graffiti, layers of human presence marking the passage of time. You walk past rooms where beds once stood in rows, so close you could hear your neighbor's nightmares, past the chapel where patients prayed for salvation that never came, past the morgue, inadequate and small, past the room where lobotomies were performed, where 24 people lost themselves and one lost everything, and as you walk, you feel it, that sensation everyone reports. You're not alone. The building remembers. Maybe it's just psychology. Maybe it's just the weight of knowledge pressing on your consciousness. Or maybe places can hold trauma the way bodies hold scars. Maybe suffering that intense doesn't dissipate when the building empties. Maybe it soaks into stone and waits for someone to witness it. You exit into the area near the cemetery. The sun has set completely now. Darkness pools around you. Not far from here, in communal plots at Denbigh Cemetery, lie bodies whose names were lost to time and bureaucratic indifference. You think about the families who might have searched for these people, who might have wanted to mourn properly but found no individual grave, no marker, no acknowledgement that their loved one had ever existed, and you understand, finally, what Denbigh Asylum really represents. It's not just a building. It's a testament to what happens when we decide some lives are worth less than others, when we prioritize institutional convenience over individual humanity, when we convince ourselves that the end justifies the means, even when the end is just making difficult people easier to manage and the means is destroying who they are. It's a warning written in stone and suffering. This is what we're capable of. This is what we've done. This is what we might do again if we're not vigilant. Remember where we started. 24 people had their brains deliberately damaged. One never woke up. The others walked out as someone else. That isn't folklore. It's the record. Denbigh's towers will fall, the paint will peel, the files will yellow. But memory is a choice. If we forget, we repeat. If we remember, we resist. If this story matters to you, subscribe and share it with someone who thinks places can't remember. And tell me in the comments, what institution today should we be looking at with the same courage? The lights are going out at Denbigh. Don't let the names go dark with them.